This is a note for an established office patient. It contains 124 words. To figure out how much it's worth, we need to determine the level of care documented by taking apart the history, the physical exam, and the medical decision-making, and then plug that information into this table, which shows us the documentation requirements for these encounters. And remember, only 2 out of 3 key components are needed for established office patients, and we need to check the documentation against both the 1995 and 1997 E&M guidelines. The level of history is determined by referring to this table. The rules for the 95 and 97 guidelines are slightly different when it comes to documenting the HPI, which is located in this paragraph in our note. There is no difference between the 95 and 97 rules when it comes to documenting a brief HPI, which requires 1 to 3 HPI elements, but there is a difference when it comes to the extended HPI. The 95 rules require at least 4 HPI elements. The 97 rules require 4 HPI elements, or you can comment on the status of 3 chronic or inactive problems. Looking at our note, it says, patient's hypertension is well controlled on current medications, which do include an ACE inhibitor. CKD also remains stable with GFR unchanged at 29 mL per minute. Proteinuria has improved from 680 milligrams to 432 milligrams today. So here we've clearly commented on the status of 3 problems, which means we'd qualify for an extended HPI using the 1997 guidelines. You could also make the argument that we use the HPI element of severity to describe 3 problems, which means we probably would qualify for a brief HPI using the 95 rules. Now that the HPI is covered, the next step is to check the PFSH. Looking at the PFSH, which is located here in the note, you can see that not much information has been recorded. There is no difference between the 1995 and 1997 guidelines when it comes to documenting the past medical, family, and social history. Here all we said was that PFSH is remarkable for CAD and hyperlipidemia. It's not a lot of information, but certainly this does count as an element of past medical history, which gives us 1 out of 3 components of PFSH. The next step is to look at the ROS. The review of systems only takes up 1 line of our note that says ROS is negative for chest pain, edema, gross hematuria, or flank pain. This easily qualifies as review of the cardiovascular and GU systems, which means we get credit for 2 systems reviewed. There's no difference between the 1995 and 1997 guidelines when it comes to documenting the ROS. Now we can see what level of history has been recorded using both the 95 and 97 guidelines. Looking at the 95 rules first, we have a brief HPI, 1 out of 3 components of PFSH, and review of 2 systems. Since all components are needed for any level of history, this would give us an expanded problem-focused history using the 95 rules. Using the 97 guidelines, we have an extended HPI, 1 out of 3 elements of PFSH, and review of 2 systems, which adds up to a detailed history. So looking at the documentation grid for established office patients, now the first piece of the puzzle is in place. Using the 95 rules, we have an EPF history. On the other hand, using the 97 rules, the documentation supports a detailed history. The next step is to check out the physical exam. The first thing you notice about the physical exam in this note is that not much exam is actually documented. There's a big difference between the exam rules for the 95 and 97 E&M guidelines, so we need to check both. Starting with the 95 rules first, the level of exam is based on the documentation of organ systems and body areas according to this table. For this encounter, we'd get credit for examining the constitutional, respiratory, and cardiovascular systems, which means this adds up to an EPF exam using the 95 rules. The next step is to check the 1997 guidelines. The 97 exam rules are based on organ systems and bullets as defined by this table. For this patient, we get 1 bullet for recording 3 vital signs, 1 bullet for listening to the lungs, and 1 for assessing the lower extremities for edema. This adds up to only 3 bullets, which means this would qualify as only a problem-focused exam using the 97 rules. Going back to our documentation grid, now we know that using the 97 guidelines, this exam puts us right here in the table. Using the 95 guidelines, we had an EPF exam, which puts us right here in that table. So now we know we have an EPF versus a problem-focused exam. The last step is to figure out the medical decision-making. To quantify the medical decision-making, we need to look at the assessment and plan and use the medical decision-making point system. Starting with the problem points, we get 1 point each for the 3 established and stable problems of CKD, hypertension, and proteinuria. This adds up to a total of 3 problem points. The next step is to check the data points. Looking at the data points, we only get 1 point for ordering and/or reviewing labs. The next step is to check the level of risk. Looking at the table of risk, here we have 2 or more stable chronic illnesses, which means this encounter definitely would qualify as being of moderate risk. So we have 3 problem points, 1 data point, and moderate risk. Since only 2 out of 3 dimensions are needed, this adds up to moderate complexity medical decision making. Now that we know how all the key components add up using both the 95 and 97 guidelines, we can determine the level of care documented. Remember, for these encounters, only 2 out of 3 qualifying key components are needed for any given level of care. Starting with the history and looking at both the 95 and 97 rules, we have an EPF versus detailed history, an EPF versus problem-focused exam, and moderate complexity medical decision-making. And again, since only 2 out of 3 key components are needed, this adds up to a level 3 visit using the 95 rules and a level 4 visit using the 97 guidelines. In this situation, an auditor would be instructed to use the version which works out best for the doctor. So the final level of care would be a level 4 established office visit. So we knew this note contains 124 words. Now we know how much it's worth, which is about $102. For on-demand web-based E&M coding education, check out our online coding courses at emuniversity.com. We have several different curriculum options available to match any practice pattern. For multiple providers, consider signing up for a customized E&M compliance web portal, which provides a centralized platform for E&M coding education, which comes preloaded with the exact courses you select for your people and includes real-time tracking of educational activities.